right, so thanks for joining us for today's Brown Bag webinar. This is Mark Dempsey from National Convergence Technology Center, welcoming you to today's presentation of Lean and Agile Synergies and IT. If you haven't already, please do put your name and your school in the chat box for a good wealth of attendance. And questions or comments come up along the way during the presentation with Laura. Please put those in the chat box. She has set aside time again for Q&A. Christine and I are watching the chat box for things like that. Okay, so also going to be a short survey at the very end, so please stick around to that survey. We really want your feedback. Okay, so our presenter today is Laura Chang. She started her IT career as a project manager and has since continued that practice in a fresh way by blending Lean and Agile practices. She built a parallel career track in both industry as an IT consultant that includes Agile Coaching and adjunct faculty. Laura teaches here in Dallas-Fort Worth area schools like the Dallas and Collin College systems and at SMU. She's become a much sought after in technology for her soft skills and acumen for translating tech talk to the business side. Colleagues have called her the executive whisperer because she has an influencing gift of listening, counseling, coaching, seeing, and hearing between the lines, having private empathy. Laura has served in a diverse range of industries like technology, healthcare, automotive, FinTech, Government Aerotech and Defense, and communications as an Agile Coach, program project manager, and servant leader, and Scrum Master. So thank you so much, Laura, for being here with us. I'm going to reduce my screen and then show your slides and using your fix something here.
Thank you. So while Mark is bringing up my slides, I'd like to first of all make a disclaimer that I am not like the biggest Lean or Agile expert out there in the field. However, I'm a witness to what Lean and Agile practices can do in both IT and in the business. Which in turn, of course, translates to all kinds of tremendous cost savings, value, better organizational culture. And I'm going to share a really quick story, while we bring these slides up about how I worked on a program a few years ago with a large automotive company, and they were launching a new program for their communications and launching a new tool. We start off with a pilot program, and then we were going to give about another 6 months to roll out the entire program and sort of give a white glove service to all of the different users. However, because the pandemic hit in early 2020, we literally shortened a 6-month timeline to roughly 6 days. So I don't have time to go into exactly how we did that, but I will tell you that had it not been for our adoption of the Lean and Agile practices, it would have been an impossible feat. So next slide, please. So I know my audience today is originally intended for IT faculty of various colleges, but I think we may also have people from industry on here. But really, these practices, from Lean and Agile will benefit everybody. So whether you're teaching in the classroom, your students are seeking jobs within IT in industry, and then of course IT professionals who may or may not have had contact yet with these practices, which in reality are not a set of like methodologies as a lot of people like to call it. It's more of a mindset and a behavioral type of shift and thinking, and then of course in the way of acting and doing business. So that slide that I showed there is just a sort of idea of how different professionals and those of you in the audience can benefit. So really quick question: how many of you in the audience, maybe a show of hands, have you come across the terms Lean and Agile in your teaching, or many of you may even work elsewhere, while teaching part-time like I do? Can I see of hands? Well, maybe I can't see hands.
We got 2 thumbs up. That's all we got so far.
Okay.
And one more. So
okay, great. No worries. Yeah, because here's another disclaimer. There's so much to cover within the Lean manufacturing and Agile world that I won't be able to get into everything, but literally we're going to be scratching the surface. So hopefully this will just give you an idea of how you yourself can add value by introducing these practices to your students in the classroom. So we'll go to the next slide. So here we have, what we call in Lean practices, a root cause analysis. You may have heard this term. That's where you take a look at a current condition and you start identifying problems, and you're thinking about, I have this particular problem. What do I want it to look like in the end? So next slide. So currently we have this sort of, it's a visual of, where a lot of companies right now are struggling with, just not being able to roll out products very efficiently. A lot of things are taking too long. There's a lot of communication gaps and things like that. And even before the pandemic, there's been increased global competition and like a race to increase release of new products, and that demanded a better way of working. So next slide. A lot of people attributed that to another framework called waterfall. But I'm not here to demonize waterfall at all. There are some companies that use this, and maybe for a good reason, and maybe it works for them. But waterfall is traditionally used in areas like construction, where you have this premise where you have to have a foundation of sorts. So let's say you're building a house. When you're building a house, you have to have things like concrete poured before you can set up the frame, and before you can get the windows in and a roof, and things like that. And that's for good reason. There are definitely some dependencies. You can't do one thing before you finish another. But in Agile, traditionally, back in 2001, with the release of what's called the Agile Manifesto, they discovered a way of doing iterative working, where you take a set of problems or requirements and you quickly start working on it. And then you go through these loops because you get quick feedback, and then you show something that's working to the customer. So if you had a waterfall approach, especially in something like software development, you would work forever doing planning and requirements gathering and going through all the process before you finally have something to show to a customer. So Agile, it was a way of trying to get quicker feedback loops, greater communication, and fostering a lot more collaboration across different business units as well. So again, not to demonize waterfall, but that's a more traditional way of working, and that's caused maybe a lot of friction within business and technology units. So we'll go to the next slide. So here there's an author named Eric Ries who attributed to his lean startup. He wrote a book about it, and then he's also the CEO of his own startup. He said learning to see waste and systematically eliminate it has allowed lean companies such as Toyota to dominate entire industries. Lean thinking defines value as providing benefit to the customer. Anything else is waste. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so giving you guys an idea of just how important IT has become in certain companies. I'll just use Toyota as an example since I've worked there before. So right now they are in the midst of building a new battery plant, and that's, I think, North Carolina somewhere. They have a budget for that particular program alone. It might have since increased, but it's somewhere around $2.5 billion. And of that $2.5 billion, roughly 10% goes towards the IT budget. So if you think about, how important IT is in supporting just that program alone, think about how important IT is across the entire enterprise. So it's very, very important that, the IT, units have a really good and systematic and efficient way of supporting the business, which of course their main bread and butter. If nobody has guessed, Toyota makes, automobiles, but they're increasingly getting into the world of what's called mobility. So, leveraging the fact that their lean practices stem from their Toyota production system is helping them gain that competitive edge. So we'll go to the next slide. So here we look at the origins of Lean and Agile, which is the Toyota production system that I just mentioned, TPS. So you'll see these photos of different, people here, they're in this manufacturing environment. And a lot of you may be thinking, well, what does IT have to do with manufacturing? Well, a lot of you may be teaching IT classes based on things like teaching your students how to become server administrators, working on Cisco routers and switches. So, on that network infrastructure side, some of you may be teaching classes in coding and teaching students how to become those software developers that are working on, these digital products. And so that relevance of, that lean mindset and some of the agile practices. And then if you look on the right side where it says synergies for IT, you'll see that, you'll see a common thread of, things like increased efficiencies, greater collaboration, and transparency. And again, we're scratching the surface here. So, we're only talking about just some of those common tenets that are so important for IT professionals. So, by the way, if anybody has questions, comments, please feel free to put them in the chat, raise your hand. I want this to be interactive. And I'd love to address any questions that you guys have, and anything that you want to address of how to apply this in the classroom. I'd love to get your feedback, because this is also iterative. And in the future, if I have a similar audience, I'd love to be able to speak to how it serves you as academics, and also serving your students, because ultimately we want to help them, find jobs and get that competitive edge themselves. So next slide. So one key tenet of Lean in the manufacturing world, this was originally, some people talk about, W. Deming as the main person who talked about this plan, do, check, act, or plan, do, study, act cycle. And he introduced this back in, way back in like the 1950s. And he worked with key automotive makers like Ford. And in the US, it didn't gain as much traction. So he traveled to Japan and worked with people from Toyota at the time. And Toyota themselves had been working on different ways of, trying to make things more efficient, and building in things like automation. We talked about Jidoka that was introduced on the previous slide, and that means automation with human touch. So the feedback loop of constantly planning and trying that out, and then checking does it work, and then acting on, okay, what did I learn? All right, and let's continue to go through that feedback and learning loop. That is that PDCA cycle, which of course is also a very important tenet of Agile practices, because Agile also is iterative in nature. And many of you may have heard of things like Agile Scrum teams, or XP development, DevOps. All of those have the tenets of trying to increase workflow in a continuous nature so that people don't burn out, and also constantly getting that feedback from customers and as early on as possible. So we'll go to the next slide. All right, so this slide here is just a visual representation of, focusing on, how people can work better, and, just a sort of journey and flow of, how we can, retool people. We go to the next slide. And this just shows, again, a visual representation of how, the values of Lean and Agile, it's all about, first of all, there's a, customer defined value, where we want to understand what the customer has a problem identified and what it is that they're seeking. And we're mapping ways to serve them, and identifying wastes and rework and all sorts of back and forth that's just absolutely unnecessary. And then this concept of Kaizen is a Japanese word for literally change for good. So in English, we call it continuous improvement because, again, we're going through that iterative feedback cycle of, continuing to observe and learn and implement new changes. And Toyota does this on a daily basis at their manufacturing sites. And so as we go up through these pillars, you see things like standard work. What that means is standardization of work means you have a set of processes. So it's not a methodology where you're giving a prescription. Everybody must do their work step 1 exactly like this or step 2 like that. So neither Lean nor Agile are methodologies in that sense. They're not prescriptive. What they are frameworks, and they're meant to be, for a business, what works for them. Not necessarily cherry picking either. They still do recommend going through all of the different events. For example, if you're a Scrum team, because there are reasons for all the different events. But ultimately, we want to make sure that we eliminate things like batch processing and pushing work out. We want to make sure we have work identified and then prioritized so that when workers see a visualization of what needs to be done, usually in the form of what's called a Kanban, and the Kanban simply means a visual display. You might have come across a lot of people working in different tools, and maybe something like a visual board with like sticky notes, and where people are moving work across as they're flowing. So this is all intended to make sure that work is being constantly coming in at a speed that people can that they can just absolutely keep doing indefinitely. And Toyota established this flow. Actually, everything that they've learned is a lot of it actually has been from the Americans. Again, going back to Deming's PDCA and the concept of pull. We had people like Ono Taichi and Ringo, Shizuo, all these people from Toyota who came to the US and learned things like the supermarket system. Like in the 50s, they were just absolutely enthralled about like how the US supermarket had different aisles and sections, and as products disappeared from the shelves, that's the time that they would replenish. And so sort of like a light went off, and they realized it's so much better to look at what is in demand and restock and replenish just in time based on what the customer is demanding and what they're pulling from the shelves. So all of that ultimately is intended to build organizational performance, and of course at the highest optimal level, and of course gain all kinds of things, benefits like happier workers and customers, and increase value and satisfaction. Next slide.
There's one question.
Yes.
The chat box.
Lean and Agile terms often used together. What is the difference between the two concepts? Okay, thank you so much for that question, Aparna. So Lean is, like I said, both of them actually have their roots in the Toyota production system, but Lean is actually more focused on the manufacturing side. So, for example, again, going back to Toyota building automobiles. So here we have like, now this particular slide says it's 8 wastes. There are actually a lot more wastes, but there are a handful that they really kind of focus on in lean manufacturing. And so things like overproduction. So it's not just the automotive industry, but a lot of, let's just say, you could take your pick of things that are manufactured, like maybe a phone screen protector. Okay, so a phone screen protector for this phone, if they make, maybe I'm just using numbers, if they make 1,000 phones today, but they're assuming that all 1,000 of those purchasers are going to get the exact same screen protectors from the exact same manufacturers. They're probably, they would have to do some kind of a study. But if they make that assumption, oh, since we're going to sell 1,000 phones, let's just make 1,000 screen protectors. Well, lo and behold, they may only sell 200 because someone else found it somewhere cheaper, and so now they've overproduced, and that's become waste. So now they're gonna have to get rid of that excess inventory by maybe having some massive sale. But if somebody else decides to get a screen protector from another manufacturer, well, who's going to buy it now? So, that's the kind of thing that Lean would focus on. But then that translates over in the Agile world, again, software development, to same thing. If we're building a software, I'm not going to build in a whole bunch of features and buttons that the customer never asked for. Okay, so this over here, this particular slide where it talks about too much motion back and forth. Like, I've been to distribution centers and manufacturing sites where you may have people just kind of waiting around, just sitting there staring at a conveyor belt because something's stuck somewhere, or it was supposed to be somewhere at a certain time, but it didn't arrive. And so they're constantly calculating and looking for ways to minimize those kinds of downtime. And in the Agile world, of course, that translates over to a lot of that being in the service side, or product development side and software. So you may not, Agile may not necessarily translate as well over to manufacturing, but a lot of the Lean side does seem to translate well over into the Agile. So I hope that helps you a little bit more, Aparna, because you're absolutely right. A lot of people use Lean and Agile together, and because, again, they have their roots within the Toyota production system and the same philosophies. So next slide. So here, the Agile Manifesto, again, a handful of software developers got together, and right around 2001 or so, they created this thing called the Agile Manifesto. And this is not meant to say, like, we want to get rid of everything that's on the right side. It's just a focus on, we value individuals' interactions over just really rigid processes and tools, for example. So you can look it up. I have a link down below, and I'll make sure to share these slides out to everybody who's interested. And you can get a copy of the Agile Manifesto. It's just, if you Google it, then you can get your own copy of it. It's really short and sweet. It just reminds people that those communications, those interactions, those relationships matter more than rigid processes and tools and long lead times. And I have another question here. Do you introduce Scrum Agile process for IT and programming courses? Absolutely. Yeah. So programming courses, keeping students abreast of how are they going to be using their skill sets in the workplace, I think is a very good use case to introducing these frameworks early on. So I think we're pretty much at the end here. Let's see what the next slide brings up. Yeah, so this is just a collection of the different companies that employ Lean and Agile practices, and some have just absolutely phenomenal results. Like Cisco, I don't remember the exact numbers, but they had some huge cost savings, and Lego, Amazon, Apple, Ericsson, Barclays, Google, Panera Bread, and of course Toyota. They all have just absolutely huge cost savings, better employee satisfaction, better customer satisfaction, savings, and increased revenue, and all kinds of wonderful benefits. And I see we have someone who they teach it to programmers, data analysts, and absolutely wonderful. Love to hear that. So I think we have just a few more minutes left for wrap up and any kind of questions. Oh, okay. This book here, The Flow System, written by one of my favorite Lean Agilists, Nigel Thurlow, John Turner and Brian Rivera. There were a couple of my colleagues back at Toyota. This is mind-blowing, and they will show you how this DNA of the Toyota production system all flows into Lean and Agile practices, but they include things like very, very important things like complexity thinking and distributed teams and all that kind of good stuff that will just blow your mind. So if you have a chance, this book is awesome.